This is a movement series geared towards an upwards of 30 minutes movement or warm-up session prior to any kind of sport or any post-sport activity. It can be used on its own in any manner. Otherwise, it's just general movement to get the body prepared in some different positions and to train some new and different positions. This first one here is focused on the spine from the base of the skull all the way down to the tailbone. The goal is to push up through our elbows and drive our shoulder blades down and back, as well as trying to extend the low back, pulling the sacrum and the tailbone towards the back of the head. Finishing the movement by adding in some rotation, trying to shorten and lengthen the sides a little bit more. I'm going to look back towards my opposite heel, depending on the shoulder I look over. This movement is what we will call a wall angel. This is just a standing version. I'm sure there are many others. To set this up, I'm going to place my feet a short distance away from the wall so that I can straighten my back and press my lower back, mid-back, and head all into the wall with equal pressure. As I get up into the movement again, I'm going to kind of start with my arms in a field goal type post position. Elbows and shoulders at 90 degrees here. Goal of the movement is to maintain contact with the wall through our low back, upper back, base of our skull, the shoulders, elbows, and wrists, all through the up and the down movement. I'll spend about 15 seconds total on each repetition. So placing my elbows against the wall, trying to maintain contact through my low back, reaching up towards the sky as far as I can without losing too much of that contact, and then trying to drag those elbows back down against the wall. Again, really trying to maintain our back against the wall in this position. If we'd like, we can add in some extra internal and external rotation in some movements. I don't have that shown here, but it's always possible just to exaggerate those certain positions if you're familiar with them. This is just a side view of that wall angel. As you can see here, I'm doing my best to have my elbow, or at least portions of that outer elbow, against the wall, along with hand and wrist contact. As you can see, there's a little bit of space there. And as I get lowered down, it gets more difficult to maintain that contact. This next set of movements and videos is what I call Pyke press-throughs. This first video is in a neutral position. So palms flat on the ground, fingers, palms facing towards my head or in front of me. This next position, I have an internal rotation bias. So taking those fingers and palms and using them to internally rotate the shoulder, just biasing some position to stretch the shoulders a little differently each set. On the last video, I did it pretty well. But here I'm externally rotated. Goal should be to try and pull your feet as close to your hands as you can to practice the movement in a more intense fashion. Otherwise, we can scale this back. So I'm using a bench here if my shoulders can't handle as much stress with that straight down position. So still, again, driving the head and the back through the shoulders. Again, we can scale this back even further into a box or elevated box. If we don't have something like this, it's always possible to just use the wall in front of you and move how high your hands up are compared to your shoulders. This next set of movements I'll be showing here is a 4-movement series focused around the hip. This first position being a fire hydrant, which is going to be focused primarily on just abduction of the hip, so moving the hip away from the midline. It's important when doing all 4 of these movements that we are in a slight posterior pelvic tilt with what I would call a relatively neutral core, so no excessive extension of the low back and no excessive rounding out of the back. So relatively neutral position here. We can't deny movement in the area, but we can try our best to focus the movement through the hip. This one here is just a forward hurdler, so extending the leg back, externally rotating and abducting, then driving that knee up into the armpit and back through to the starting position. Again, important here to try not to excessively move that spine around. We really do want to focus on feeling this throughout different areas of our hip. It's okay if your shoulders get a little bit tired. The more you do it, the more they'll get used to this position. Just be cautious of how often and how intense we are feeling our shoulders. This is a reverse hurdler movement, so just the complete opposite of what we first did. Going to bring that hip into flexion and then abduct, externally rotate, and kick back through an extended position. Again, really focusing on not over-rotating, not over-extending the back to try and make that movement happen. What we'll finish off with are some scorpion kicks. You'll see here I do extend a little bit. It's not, I would say, important to overthink having your low back in a certain position, but it is relevant to try and accentuate the movement through the hip and not as much through the low back. This next movement in the hip series here is a hip 90-90 with some added movement and cueing for each movement while in the position. To describe it, my right hip is externally rotated with my knee at about 90 degrees. My left hip is now internally rotated with the knee also at 90 degrees. What I want to think about doing is driving my knees into the mat, almost as if I'm trying to externally rotate more and internally rotate more. The goal is to create that constant tension through the movement, and as you'll see here, my next side is going to move a lot better than the first side that I showed. That means that my left hip has better external rotation and my right hip has better internal rotation as compared to the opposing side. This movement here is a focused hip flexor movement. The goal is to start with our feet close together, imagining, if you don't have an object, that there's an object that your heel has to lift up and over. As you can see, my back is pressed up against the wall, and I'm driving my hands into the ground as well. Prior to each time I move my heel, whether it be on the ground from the inside or the outside of that object that I'm moving it over, I'm going to contract my non-used leg. So in this situation, my right leg here is going to contract and drive it into the ground through my quad and my hamstrings. While my dominant leg here that's being used, I'm doing my best to contract my quad into terminal knee extension so that when I lift that heel up and over, I know that my knee isn't dropping down to bend to compensate for the lack of shortened quad contraction in this position. As we finish up with the hips, we are going to get into a deep lunge here to start to work our ankles. What I'm going to be focusing on here is driving my knee over my toe, trying to bring my butt as close to my heel as I possibly can. And then my goal is to create pressure through my midfoot, aka the balls of my foot, driving that calf up into a plantar flex position, like a single leg calf raise. I want to make sure to not grab the ground with my toes. I just want to allow my toes to create pressure through the floor, and at my end range, you'll see here, is I will be up on those toes, but still driving through the balls of my feet. This can help with big toe mobility, as well as some of that ankle mobility. Learning how to move and contract through that full plantar flexion range of motion. Some of that can sometimes be limited by the toes, so just make sure you are moving through these positions comfortably. Pain should not be a huge part. Our last setup here is likely the most passive out of all of the movements that we'll do. Mostly focused on using the ankles and the toes to press into ranges of motion that maybe feel blocked or need some more stress behind them to create a change in that tissue length. So as you'll see here, I kind of will bounce and rock back and forth. Goal is to create pressure through the heels and transfer that into the toes. So my toes are actually tucked underneath my feet here, and I'm almost continually driving through those toes, trying to continually press those heels back to create that tension in the back of my leg and the back of my calf. We'll hang out here for about 1 minute, kind of just feeling it around and moving our hips, our ankles, and our torso around to change the way we feel that tension. We're then going to follow up by untucking our toes and flattening out the top of our feet onto the ground. As you see here, I will use my hands to help assist that position. Sometimes we have to work into this, and it can be relatively uncomfortable as your body's not used to driving its weight into its ankles like this. Again, the goal of these movements is to use our joints and the muscles around them to increase the tension and muscle action within that specific position. So here I'm actually driving through the front of my shin, thinking of pulling my toes and the top of my feet towards my knees, almost like you're pulling your toes up towards your knees, but it is blocked by the ground. Each time that I create that contraction, I'll relax it for a little bit and try and move deeper into the position. Moving your torso back over your ankles is going to do the same thing and help increase the depth of that stretch. Again, hanging out here for about a minute. This is where we will finish up our movement series. I'll have some descriptions posted in the comments as well as sets and rep schemes. Thanks for watching.